was a rainy afternoon when Emily found herself at the library, her sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. A small town library, nestled between rows of old, crumbling houses, had always offered a sense of quiet solace. The scent of dust and leather-bound books mixed with the earthy aroma of the wet ground outside, creating an odd sense of comfort. She had come to study. Of course, her final exams were just around the corner, but she had always been a little drawn to the library's atmosphere. It was a strange place, one that often felt a little too still, as if time had slowed down within its walls. The library, a two-story structure, was mostly empty on weekdays, and today was no different. Emily made her way up to the second floor, where the old history and folklore books were kept, rows upon rows of them stacked tightly together like forgotten secrets. She picked a secluded corner by the large window, where the rain pattered softly against the glass. The place felt abandoned, but not in an eerie way, more like a place waiting to be rediscovered. As she sat down, she noticed a man across the room, sitting at a table by the reference section. He was hunched over a book, but his face was hidden by the shadows. She shrugged it off. Libraries, after all, were places for people to get lost in their own thoughts, their own worlds. After a few hours, Emily's eyelids began to feel heavy. The rain outside had grown louder, a constant thrum against the window. She was starting to drift into a drowsy haze when she heard something whisper. It was faint at first, so quiet she thought it was just the sound of the wind or the rustling of pages. Then it came again, a soft, low murmur. Emily ... It was her name. Spoken slowly, in a voice she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped. She glanced around, but the library was still as silent as ever. No one was near her, and the man in the corner was still engrossed in his book, his head bent low. She tried to shake it off as her imagination running wild, but something nagged at the back of her mind. The whisper had been too clear, too specific. She turned back to her study materials, trying to refocus, but the feeling lingered. She felt, watched, a subtle, creeping sensation that seemed to crawl over her skin. The whisper came again, this time louder. Emily, she froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was coming from the shelves. She stood up, her hands trembling. She knew that part of the library well, the older section, with its towering shelves of forgotten knowledge. The aisles between the shelves were narrow, dimly lit by the occasional flickering overhead light. She knew she hadn't seen anyone else come up here in the last hour, and the man at the reference desk hadn't moved. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice quivering slightly. There was no answer, only the soft sound of something shifting behind the bookshelves. She walked cautiously down the aisle, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air felt colder here, and the faint smell of old paper mixed with something else, a strange, musty odor, almost like decay. She rounded the corner and froze. On the top shelf, slightly askew, was a book. It wasn't one of the usual ones. This was a thick, heavy leather-bound volume, unlike anything she had ever seen before in the library. It seemed to beckon to her, its cover a deep, unnerving shade of red. Her curiosity overpowered her caution. She reached up and pulled the book from the shelf, her fingers brushing against its textured surface. As she opened it, an unexpected coldness swept over her. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faded in places, but the words, strange symbols, and cryptic writing seemed to shift as if alive. Then, she heard it again. Emily. The voice was no longer a whisper but a growl, deep and guttural, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Before she could react, the lights above her flickered and then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. The book slipped from her hands, landing with a muffled thud on the floor. Panic surged through her. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam sliced through the shadows, revealing rows of bookshelves and stacks of old, forgotten novels. But it wasn't the books that caught her attention. In the corner of the room, something shifted. It was a figure tall, hunched, with elongated limbs. At first, Emily thought it was just her mind playing tricks in the dark, but as the figure moved closer, she realized it was no illusion. The man from earlier, the one she had seen sitting by the reference section, was now standing in the aisle, his face still hidden in shadow. But this wasn't the same man. The man before her had an unnatural, twisted appearance, his body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were black as coal, hollow and empty. His mouth hung open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. He was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a grin filled with malice, stretching far too wide for a human face. "Emily," he rasped, his voice like a dry whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't have opened the book." Before she could react, the room seemed to close in on her. The shelves trembled, and the walls seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly energy. The figure stepped closer, his movements jerky, unnatural. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The books on the shelves seemed to shift, their spines warping as if alive, their pages rustling in the absence of wind. Emily backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure advanced, its eyes never leaving her, its mouth opening wider as if to speak again. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. The figure froze, its expression shifting into one of confusion or perhaps fear. Suddenly, the library lights flickered back on, blindingly bright. The figure vanished into the air, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling silence. Emily stood, her hands shaking, heart pounding in her chest. She could barely process what had just happened. The figure had been real. She wasn't imagining it. And the book, it wasn't just a book. It had brought something into the library, something that wasn't supposed to exist. Without thinking, she grabbed the book and hurried down the aisle, heart hammering in her chest. She didn't care about her studies anymore. She needed to get out, needed to leave before whatever that thing was could return. When she reached the exit, she turned to look back one last time. The library seemed to stretch on forever, the aisles filled with the soft rustling of pages. And in the silence, she heard it again, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. "Emily," but this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. She would never escape. The library had always been a place of comfort for Sarah. As a librarian in a small town, she found peace among the books, surrounded by the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood. Most of the time, the library was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of pages or the soft click of computer keys, but tonight was different. It was her last shift before the library closed for the night, and something about the stillness felt off. It had been a long day, and Sarah was eager to finish up her shift and head home. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 9 p.m., the hour when the library officially closed its doors. Most patrons had already left, save for a few stragglers who were finishing up their reading or browsing the shelves. She had just finished shelving a stack of returned books when she noticed something odd. One of the tables in the far corner of the library was still occupied by a man. He sat alone, hunched over a book, his face obscured by the shadows cast from a single flickering overhead light. At first, Sarah thought nothing of it. He must have been engrossed in his reading. But as she passed by, she couldn't help but notice how still he was, how his posture seemed unnaturally rigid. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice soft but firm. "The library is about to close." The man didn't respond. Sarah felt a slight unease crawl up her spine. She took a step closer. "Sir? You'll need to check out that book before we close." Still no response. Her unease deepened. She knew everyone who came into the library regularly, and she couldn't remember ever seeing this man before. He didn't look like someone who belonged here. His clothes were old, worn almost as though they hadn't been washed in days, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the book. There was something about the way he sat, hunched over, that felt wrong. "Sir," she repeated, her voice a little louder this time. Finally, the man looked up. His eyes were dark, vacant, almost lifeless, and they locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. His gaze lingered for a moment too long, and then, without a word, he slowly stood up, pushing the book across the table toward her. The gesture was almost mechanical, as if he were being forced to move. Sarah hesitated but took the book. It was a thick, dusty hardcover, the title faded from years of neglect. She glanced at the checkout desk and then back at the man, wondering if he'd say anything, but he didn't. He just stood there, watching her with those unnerving eyes. "Do you have a library card?" she asked, trying to maintain her professionalism despite the growing discomfort in her chest. The man didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps eerily quiet against the wooden floor. He moved toward the back of the library, the shadows swallowing him as he disappeared behind the aisles. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, the book still in her hands. Something about this felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She tried to shake off the feeling and walked to the checkout station, scanning the book into the system. The machine beeped, and the screen flashed a confirmation message, but then it froze. A loud, mechanical grinding sound filled the air as the checkout terminal sputtered, then blinked off completely. The lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah looked around the room, her pulse quickening. She could hear the soft rustle of pages turning in the distance, and it sounded like it was coming from the back aisle, where the man had disappeared. "Hello," she called out, her voice wavering. "Is someone still here?" No answer, just the soft turning of pages. She moved cautiously toward the back, her footsteps echoing louder than usual. The air felt colder as she neared the back aisle, and the flickering lights cast strange, distorted shapes across the walls. She reached the end of the row of shelves, where the man had disappeared moments before. The aisle was empty. Confused, she glanced up and down the rows. The books were all in their places, neat and untouched. There was no sign of the man, but then she noticed something odd. At the far end of the aisle, a book was sitting on the floor, slightly ajar, as if it had been dropped hastily. The cover was unfamiliar to her, and its spine looked brittle, as though it had been in the library for decades. Curiosity gnawed at her, but caution held her back. She stepped toward the book, crouching down to pick it up. When her fingers brushed the cover, a cold wave of dread washed over her. The title, once faded, now seemed to glow faintly. The last checkout. Her heart began to race. She felt a sudden compulsion to open the book, though she couldn't explain why. She flipped it open to the first page, and her eyes widened in disbelief. The page was filled with what appeared to be a handwritten list of names, dozens of names, each written in neat, looping script. And at the very bottom of the page, in bold, unsettling letters, was her name, Sarah Allen. Her breath caught in her throat. She dropped the book as if it had burned her, stumbling backward. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. Was this some kind of prank? But it didn't make sense. No one knew her full name like that. Before she could even process the fear that had taken root in her chest, the library's lights went out completely, plunging the entire building into darkness. Sarah froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could hear it faint, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps, slow, methodical, like someone was walking toward her. "Hello," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Who's there?" The footsteps continued, coming closer and closer until they were right behind her. Then, a low, rasping voice whispered in her ear, "It's time to go." Sarah spun around, her breath caught in her throat, but there was no one there. The room was empty. She was alone. But the sense of dread remained, thick and suffocating. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, and in the weak beam of light, she saw it. A shadow, standing just outside the doorway, watching her. The shadow was too still, too unnatural, the shape of a man, but wrong. Her legs shook as she backed away toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic gripped her as she pulled at the handle, but it was locked. She tried to remember the emergency procedures, the keys for the back door, anything, but nothing came to mind. The shadow in the doorway seemed to grow, stretching out unnaturally as it moved closer. "Sarah!" The voice rasped again, just behind her. "It's time to check out." With trembling hands, she fumbled with the keys and finally managed to open the door. She bolted out of the library, not looking back until she was safely in her car, the lights of the library still visible in the rearview mirror. The shadow was gone, but the name in the book still haunted her. And as she drove away, the words echoed in her mind. The last checkout. Catherine had always loved working at the library. The scent of books, the quiet hum of whispered voices, and the calming atmosphere made it the perfect job for a student trying to balance her studies. But tonight, on her late shift, something felt different. Something was off. It was 9:30 p.m., and the library was nearly empty. The last patron had left almost an hour ago, and the fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting long shadows across the rows of bookshelves. Catherine had just finished shelving the last of the returned books and was about to start her closing duties when she heard a noise. A book had fallen to the floor. She frowned, looking up from the desk where she was sitting. The sound had come from the back of the library, where the history section was located. Catherine had checked just moments ago. No one else was there. She stood up, hesitated for a moment, and then walked towards the back aisle. The silence in the library was almost suffocating. Her footsteps echoed off the walls as she moved toward the source of the sound. She reached the history section, but there was no sign of anyone. The shelves were orderly, the lights flickered slightly, but nothing else seemed out of place. Then, she spotted a book on the floor, a thick, dusty volume from the shelf she had just organized. Catherine sighed, crouched down to pick it up, and placed it back where it belonged. She glanced around again. No one. Probably just a draft, she muttered to herself, though she didn't quite believe it. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. As she turned to head back to the front desk, something caught her eye. At the far end of the library, just near the large windows that overlooked the street, stood a man. He was hunched over, as if looking at something intently, his back to her. She could only see his silhouette, but something about him seemed out of place. Catherine's heart raced. The library had been empty when she last checked, and it was well past closing time. She walked toward him, clearing her throat. "Excuse me, sir," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "The library is closed. You'll need to leave." The man didn't respond. He remained perfectly still, his head slightly tilted downward. Catherine's stomach tightened. She stepped closer. "Sir," she said, her voice more firm this time. Without warning, the man turned to face her. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. His eyes were dark to dark. In the dim lighting, they seemed almost black, lifeless. His face was gaunt, pale, with hollowed cheeks, and his lips were pressed into a thin, tight line. He looked wrong, but what bothered her most was how he stared at her. It wasn't a curious glance or a polite acknowledgement, it was an unblinking, intense gaze, as if he were waiting for something. "Can I help you?" Catherine asked, trying to stay calm. The man didn't speak, but he slowly stepped toward her, his movements unnervingly slow. Catherine instinctively backed up, her fingers trembling as she reached for her phone in her pocket, ready to call for help. The man stopped just a few feet away from her. His expression hadn't changed. His mouth opened, and for a split second, Catherine thought he might say something, but no words came. Instead, a low, rasping sound escaped from his throat, almost like a whisper. "Help," he breathed, his voice so faint that it sounded like it came from miles away. Catherine froze. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he spoke, the way his voice barely reached her ears. Her gut told her something wasn't right. She needed to get away. "Stay back," Catherine shouted, holding up her phone in front of her as if it were a shield. The man didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, as though considering her words. Then, in a moment that felt like a dream, he started to move again, his steps impossibly quiet, as if he wasn't walking at all. Catherine stumbled backward, her hands shaking, until her back hit the bookshelf. She was cornered. "Please," she gasped, heart pounding, trying to remain composed. "I'll call the police." The man's lips curled into a slow, eerie smile. His eyes never left her. "You'll be fine," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "You'll be fine." Catherine's fear surged, and she bolted for the exit. She fumbled for the door's lock, her hands slick with sweat. She could hear the man's slow, deliberate steps behind her, the sound echoing in the stillness. Finally, the door clicked open, and she rushed out into the night. The cold air hit her like a shock, but it did little to calm her racing heart. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Breathing heavily, Catherine slammed the door shut and locked it. She glanced around the empty parking lot, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Shaking, she started the car and drove away as quickly as she could. The image of his face, the unnerving, lifeless eyes haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out of the library. The next day, Catherine returned to work, determined to put the night behind her. She was greeted by her coworker, Melissa, who was standing behind the front desk. "Hey, Catherine, you won't believe this," Melissa said, a curious look on her face. "I found something strange this morning. A book from the history section was left on the floor. And when I checked it in, The computer showed it was never checked out. It had been in the library for years, but no one had ever borrowed it. Catherine's blood ran cold. She didn't need to hear more. It was the history of abandoned souls. And as she thought about the man's eerie smile, she knew he had been waiting for someone to check it out. Alright everyone, that brings us to the end of our story. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And if you have similar stories you'd like to share with us, feel free to reach out. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.